Dear viewers, welcome to Bangladesh Bhabna special show Connecting with Imam. This is Hussain Imam, editor Bangladesh Bhabna. Today we have a special guest, Professor Dr. László Andor. Welcome to our show, Mr. László.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before I going to ask you a question, first let me introduce who is Dr. László Andor. He's an economist, academic, influential policymaker who served as a EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion between 2010 to 2014. Since stepping down from the Commission, he has been the head of the Department of Economic Policy, Corbias University Budapest, Senior Fellow, Harty School of Governance Berlin, a visiting professor at ULB Brussels, as well as Sciences Po Paris. He also became member of the various think tanks, EPC, RAND Europe, Friends of Europe in an advisory capacity. He also worked as an advisor for the Budget Committee of the Hungarian Parliament from 1998 to 1999 and the Prime Minister's Office from 2002 to 2005. From 2005 to 10, he was a member of Board of Directors of the EBRD London, representing Czech Republic, Croatia, Hungary and Slovakia. Since 2019, he has been the Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, FEPS. Mr. Andor, you have a wide range of capacity. You worked for Hungarian government, European Commissioner. So today we will talk about Europe lens on geopolitics and global issues. So Mr. Andor, let me begin with a question on very recent US national security strategy, because I saw that you have written already about this. So how do you evaluate this strategy for Europe and the world?
Yes, I think we live in a time of a global change, a global transformation. The United States of America is redefining its role in the international system. We got used to a type of approach when the US, at least on formalities, committed to multilateralism, preferred to work with allies, with partners, and now we are witnessing a transition to a heavy approach on economic nationalism and a withdrawal from multilateral structure. Of course, in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union disappeared, there was a kind of unipolar moment when indeed in the United States there was a tendency to lead, but also leading without constraints. And again, this kind of unipolarity seems to last. On the other hand, the commitment to multilateralism seems to be over. And we saw this coming in the last 1 year since the return of Donald Trump in the White House. But now this new document, the National Security Strategy, puts everything on paper in a very, very pedagogical way in order to avoid any kind of misunderstandings. And this is an expression of the intent to dominate completely the Western Hemisphere. I think what concerns the Western Hemisphere, especially Latin America, to some extent also Canada, the intention to dominate in very direct forms is very obvious. On the other hand, what concerns the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, I think it's a little bit more complex. There is no a sense of having a capacity to dominate directly. At the same time, the US again seems to withdraw from the security arrangements of Europe that were developed after World War II. They also seem to withdraw from a heavy engagement in the Middle East. And at the same time, China remains a main preoccupation for the United States, which is a main economic rival, while Russia is the main military adversary of the United States. But in this Eastern Hemisphere, the tendency, which I expect, is a kind of divide and rule approach, allowing several different centers of power, some more economic, other more military. Europe.
So what is the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration on this regard? Because as you know that they have a Indo-Pacific strategy and a long-term global strategy. So what is the difference between these two?
Yes, and I think the Biden administration can still be characterized with a so-called liberal internationalist approach. Liberal internationalist when you have a global orientation and assuming that the United States has a responsibility, sometimes even a mission, to promote democracy, to promote liberal economic and political structures, and much of the US administration was also tuned in order to serve this. And since the return of Donald Trump, we have seen that the new leadership started to dismantle a lot of institutions which have been serving these engaging liberal policies of the Biden administration, at least verbally.
Like USID.
And USID especially, I think this is very important, which I think a lot of people consider the kind of soft power of the United States. So somehow Donald Trump and his government doesn't mind burning.
He said America First policy.
America First, which is a very nationalist approach indeed, and then withdraw from these perceived responsibilities of the United States. I think this is, of course, coming with a lot of cost, because sometimes for emerging economies, the aid policy of the US, but also Europe, contributed to upholding education structures, health services, research and related activities also. So I think the costs will be felt. At the same time, these institutions were also channels of intervention. And the intervention, especially in politics, was not always appreciated by the local population and the local politicians.
So now let me ask a very burning question for Europe and around the world. Russia-Ukraine war. How do you underscore EU and USA relationship consider Russia-Ukraine war and NATO's role in promoting peace and security in Europe?
Yes, there is a striking difference between the approach of Joe Biden and Donald Trump about concerns Ukraine and Russia. Since Donald Trump returned, there is a lot more friendliness towards Russia and tough, if you want, a harsh approach towards Ukraine. Is not entirely a novelty, because when Trump was president first time, there were similar tendencies. Also at that time, Donald Trump was putting pressure on the European countries to increase their financial contribution, their spending on military, and contribute to the common costs of NATO. And according to the judgment of Donald Trump, and the people around him, Europe would need to do more. And interestingly, Europe committed a lot more during the summer to military spending. Nevertheless, everybody feels that the commitment of the US to NATO and the defense of Europe is much weaker now than in the previous decades.
So unfortunately, Donald Trump, Europe and Asia, China, India, all over the world want to end this war. What is the problem? Because whole world is facing stagflation and high unemployment. I'm from Finland. I know almost more than 10% unemployment in the history. Maybe 20 or 30 years in history of Europe. It's unbelievable. So how do you? What is your view to end this war, and how win-win situation? It's for Russia, it's for Ukraine, it's for Europe and USA.
Yes, it's true in my view that many stakeholders, countries, national governments would like to see the end of this war, but they would like to see different conclusions of this war. And if there is a divergence between the expectations and different assessment of the dynamics on the battlefield, then it's very difficult to end the war. So that's what I believe is happening. The United States changed its approach because under Joe Biden, they were clearly supporting Ukraine, maybe not very strongly, and I think it was also true that under Biden, the US started to withdraw from the support of Ukraine and started to push the costs of the war on the Europeans. And now this is very obviously the case under Trump, who told the European countries that either you finance the continuation of the war or we put an end to this. at the expense of Ukraine, because the consequence of this would be that Ukraine cannot achieve its maximalist goals in the war. What would be maximalist? To restore the 1991 borders of Ukraine, which also include Crimea.
So, what is Europe leaders think? Should they fully depend on NATO, or they must think on their own new security strategy, and who will take the charge to end this war? Is it USA? Is it China? Is it India? Is it Europe?
Well, I see China and India to keep a distance. There was a moment 1 year after the war started when China came forward with a peace plan, and that bounced back very quickly. So I believe China and India and other countries on different continents keep a certain distance. There was also a moment when African presidents, African country leaders went to Russia and Ukraine to try to facilitate some kind of convergence, but it didn't happen. There was also a moment when the Pope Francis, was calling for the end of the war, but he also didn't succeed. I think now Donald Trump has a very straightforward approach, and he would like to negotiate some kind of compromise, some kind of deal, putting pressure on both sides. So he puts pressure on the Ukrainian leadership, but he also puts pressure on the Russian leadership, because the sanctions also escalated in this period, and the various strikes against targets on the territory of the Russian Federation also continue. So there is pressure on both sides from the United States. Most of the European countries, I would say, because maybe Europe is not homogeneous, but I would say most of the European countries would still try to find a way to help Ukraine to a better position. Why? Because it's Ukraine which has been attacked. It's Ukraine whose territory was invaded. And if we would like to uphold international law, then it also means that borders of countries should not be changed by force. And somehow the war would need to end with an arrangement which saves as much as possible from these principles.
Thank you very much. Now let me begin. Let me discuss about the EU-Bangladesh relationship. I know Bangladesh is one of the trading partner, especially RNG sector.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you actually evaluate EU-Bangladesh relationship as one of the global influential democratic community views Bangladesh political transition? I will come through on economic issues as well, because you were expert on it. So political transition in Bangladesh and regime change in August 2024. How do you actually assess this change?
Yes, I think in the last 30 years there was a lot of development, and I think the trade and investment relations between Bangladesh and Europe developed very well. When I was a student, Bangladesh was still considered to be among the less developed countries. There's been an industrialization. Bangladesh found a new place in the international division of labor. There are many competitive firms, new brands emerged, and especially in textile industry, the country became a very significant player. Of course, if you find the Bangladeshi share in European trade, that's probably still small because of the distance and because of the greater share of other countries which are closer to Europe or more traditional trade and investment partners. But still, India is also important, Bangladesh is important, Pakistan is important, and the whole Southeast Asia has become increasingly important for the European Union in the period of the globalization. And I think both sides have been interested in peaceful and constructive economic cooperation, which applies to trade, but also applies to investment and some further activities as well. Now, when it comes to the political instability, of course, political instability is not good, right? So it's a violent regime change is never good news. And I think the European countries, leaders of the EU institutions, have been witnessing with a lot of concern what has been happening in the last 18 months. Because the EU in general, whether it is Bangladesh or other countries, would need to represent the principles of human rights, democracy, the rule of law. And when we see this violated, including the violation of the rights of minorities, whether we speak about ethnic or religious minorities, of course this is a great problem. The EU has, especially when it's very distant geographically, very limited capacity to intervene. But I would expect the European leaders to express their concern and try to do something.
Let me draw your attention, as you just mentioned, Bangladesh has been transformed from a test case of development into a developing country recognized by the UN and the World Bank, IMF, and the
Yes.
Europe think tanks. So unfortunately, the country has become a state of mob violence, and is captured by even the Muhammad Yunus, so-called Nobel laureate, once was an ambassador of Nobel Peace Prize. Now,
Indeed.
unfortunately, is backing by the extremists, and extremists captured, destroyed other religious people's temples, other religious worship, institutions, and killed them, and persecuted them. So even we raised the issues in Geneva UN headquarters. So how do you underscore these issues? Backing by the extremist, by Yunus regime, and it's like no one is safe.
Well, my fear is that the detailed knowledge about these developments in Europe is lacking. Maybe I know a little bit more than the average European about these issues, but to some extent this also applies to myself, that it's not so easy to follow all these developments in detail, but when you hear about the violence, when you hear about the intolerance, atrocities against different groups of the population, then it's a great concern. And let's be honest, in the last 2 years, we have also been witnessing the tragic developments in Gaza. And it's also true that in the case of Gaza, different European countries behaved differently. Some governments expressed concern, some governments tried to put pressure on Israel in order to stop the genocide. Other countries were maybe not indifferent, but more lenient, and tried even to help the government of Netanyahu to carry out all the atrocities in Gaza against the Palestinian population. And it's not only Gaza, but also the West Bank, where violence has been very often just tolerated by various European governments. And so in a way, Bangladesh is even more distant from a European perspective.
No, but that's what we are drawing your attention and want to get your views, because you are mentioned that Europe is concerned about the human rights and democracy, and these issues is very, very important to the Western world, and even any part of the world. So 5,100 of people are in jail of the opponent political party. Mostly secular voices have been detained and persecuted, and more than 3,000 girls and women have been raped, especially from minorities community, and try to exclude the political parties. Upcoming election might be in February, I don't know. Try to eliminate or exclude the major political parties who have supported, and even using judiciary to give them sentence. They already sentenced our legitimate Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina death sentence. This is unbelievable.
Yes.
She doesn't get any state defense, no defense. Even other ministers and people, they try to persecute them, and the field is clear. Then they will arrange a one-sided election. So how you will view what is your view on inclusive election and human rights violation and detain more than 500,000 people in the jail?
Well, I have to say that most of this has been absolutely unexpected from a European perspective. So a lot of people in Europe have the view that if there is economic development, that brings with itself social and political development, big countries become more advanced also in terms of the domestic arrangement. And when you see an upheaval like this, the violence erupting, the new power structure becoming so aggressive against political opponents, using methods which would not be acceptable in Europe or elsewhere in Asia. I mean, this is not the way to do politics. So I think the world is turning upside down, and the international community, broadly speaking, would need to pay more attention. Also, the neighboring countries, I suppose. India is very close, and countries in South Asia maybe could have some closer cooperation for upholding the democratic standards.
Now, India is, taking their stance very clear already by the Foreign Minister Jaishankar, Indian Prime Minister Modi,
He's amazing,
and for even the Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri. But Europe's voice is very very important in terms of human rights, democracy, and this inclusion.
Yes.
So I am going through on economic issues because being an economist. So if when I met you on September, you talked that you met few years back with Yunus. So he advocated his microcredit policy that it is reducing. He will send the property in the museum. Always advocated, and so-called 3-0. This is very very what it calls. It's the idea of many people, many experts said it's the idea of utopia. So how do you evaluate his his so-called microcredit policy for reducing poverty and inequality around the world?
Yes, no, this is a very interesting question because you rightly pointed to this that about 15 years ago, the European Union was also experimenting with microfinance, and this was after the great financial crisis when people saw the big banking system failing. And a lot of the large commercial banks also had to be bailed out because of the situation of the bankruptcy in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, which started in the United States, but also engulfed many countries, including the European ones. And the European financial crisis lasted very long. And that was also the time when I had a meeting with Mr. Yunus, I assume in Vienna, when there was a big congress of microfinance. And I think maybe at that time there was a kind of excessive expectation, some idealism, that the big banks are big banks are too big to fail. They get bailed out. They are on the other hand destined to move away from the everyday reality of the population. And indeed, there was a strong campaign in favor of microfinance, which I think can be useful in certain conditions. At the same time, to assume that microfinance in general is a good way to save the population from poverty, it's obviously false, right? Microfinance can help if, for example, there are certain...
Only hand to mouth, you can say?
No, what I think is that if people have experience and skills, and they would like to turn themselves into entrepreneurs.
No, most of them are illiterate women. They have to repay their, this amount of money from the next week. So
that's
what
the
kind
very
of initiative
unsuitable.
you have? You can earn money from within the week, and you have to repay next week.
Yes,
and people are falling trapped. The one journalist from Denmark, Dan Heyman, he made a video documentary. It calls microcredit debt trap.
Exactly. Yes, people can easily fall into a debt trap. In the Western world, the so-called payday loan, right? Sometimes people are so poor that their wages are not sufficient until the end of the month, and they borrow somewhere, and at a condition with a credit with an interest rate which is too much, and then people fall into a situation when they can refinance the debt with further borrowing, and that's a very clear case of a debt trap, and people can lose their wealth. So that's why in Europe this was not the direction, right? So it's where Europeans use microfinance, it's not for the most destitute part of the population. Because obviously for the poorer people, you need first of all social security, you need aid, you need some kind of financial support to have housing, to have health service, and start a decent life, but not loans. The loans can function if somebody can become an entrepreneur, and in order to have the first steps to establish an enterprise with mentoring, with coaching, additional support, you provide some kind of concessional loan scheme. This is a viable scheme, but to assume that against large-scale poverty, microfinance would need to be the solution. I'm not really doubtful, but I think I'm categorically negative on this.
Thank you very much. Now I have a quick question. The first one on RMG, GSP plus trade preference for Bangladesh. How European Union will think about GSP plus facilities for Bangladesh based on this? Because as far as I know, that they evaluate so many issues: the trade scenario, the labor rights, democratic issues, human rights issues. So, what is your take on GSP plus preference for Bangladesh?
Yes, again, I can recall something which I remember from my work with Bangladesh, which was a very sad case, the Rana Plaza disaster.
Yeah, right.
When many people were buried by a collapsing factory building, and it was also learned that some of the workers wanted to give voice to their concerns. It was not possible. So, for example, when you experience something like that, you have to ensure that such conditions do not prevail in the industry, and the owners of the corporations, they ensure that the health and safety of the working people is guaranteed. And then that sometimes requires a change in the labor law. Sometimes it also helps if there is a trade union and there's an opportunity to negotiate about the working conditions. So certain types of requirements can be made also in the context of trade deals, trade agreements. And in a way, both sides would need to see that an economic cooperation leads to progress. And it's a win-win game, right? So the trade, international trade, is not supposed to foster exploitation in the developing countries. It needs to foster investment and ideally growing wages and improving working conditions. So I'm in favor of that type of conditionality. Otherwise, I think people in Europe are happy customers of Bangladeshi products, and I think most Europeans would not mind paying a little bit more if it guarantees that the social and the environmental standards in Bangladesh continue to improve.
Thank you very much. Now, one quick question about Indo-Pacific strategy. As you know, it is very crucial thing right now that is pursuing by the United States. And so, let me ask about these issues. What does the European Union see for itself in the Indo-Pacific strategy alongside with the USA?
Well, exactly. I mean, I suppose this is also a territory of a tremendous change and transformation, because you can say that the Indo-Pacific region is distant from Europe, but at the same time with many countries, starting with China, but also Vietnam, but also Thailand, Malaysia, there has been a lot of cooperation, let alone a kind of privileged relationship with Japan, and if you look at these relations, East Asia is not even distant from Europe. There are so many links. But the question is, to what extent this should be an economic relationship, or a more broader, strategic cooperation, which also pays attention to the security issues. I think many Europeans are sensitive to human rights. A lot of the Europeans look into questions of China, questions of Taiwan, through the lens of peace, democracy, and the human rights, and would like to see developments in this field. Nevertheless, because China is so big, India is also very big, there's also a lot of pragmatism in this relation. So somehow this balance between commitment to improvement on the one hand and pragmatic cooperation on the other hand needs to be found.
That's great. Last question to you. Is there any perceived double standard in Europe's stance on democracy promotion in the global south? It's a tough one, but I want to hear.
Yes, I think we have a lot of concern about double standards. For example, some of my colleagues were writing a piece which compared the European approach to Ukraine and Gaza. And of course, in terms of the level of engagement and the orientation, it was very, very clear and forceful on Ukraine, and quite mixed, I would say, regarding Gaza. Of course, it's easy to say that Ukraine, which is a country under attack, has a border with 4 EU member states. So starting with these 4 EU member states, but also many others, there can be a more direct effect of the war, while some other countries are distant. Nevertheless, I think Europeans, because we also believe in multilateralism, we are also committed to multilateralism. It means that all these institutional relations can only stand and be credible on a universalist basis, right? That peace, democracy, human rights, minority rights needs to be universal. And when maybe we cannot intervene everywhere, but we need to raise our voice if we see that something is going badly or something is going to the wrong direction in different parts of the world. And there are always kind of very complex conflictual situations. If I just mentioned Venezuela, that the United States is inventing, a certain ground to prepare interventions here and there and everywhere, and obviously that's hugely problematic and controversial if these types of interventions are prepared or taking place. There are many wars at the same time happening. Maybe a few dozen wars in different parts of the world. I would say that Europe would do best to have a kind of credible and consistent policy for peace and development, and to find allies to uphold the multilateral institutions, which can also serve peace and development and sustainability.
Thank you very much, Mr. László.
Thank you.
This is great to have you, and hope our viewers like to hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, dear viewers, that's all for today. Connecting with Imam. Hope you will see and watch. So, thank you very much.